I'm Pamela Passman. I lead the Center for Responsible Enterprise and Trade, create.org, and we work with companies and their third parties on anti-corruption, intellectual property protection, trade secret protection, and cybersecurity. So we work with companies to help protect their information, and often we think, wow, it would have been great if they actually had a more systematic way of organizing and thinking about their information so they were able to protect it in a more consistent, comprehensive way. So I'm thrilled to be moderating the panel today with folks who work on these issues every day. Avis Russell is the Vice President and Chief Compliance Officer for Parsons, the engineering, construction, and management services company. And Avis also had some experience in the DC government as well before that. And R.E.A. Friedman is the Vice President, Associate General Counsel, and Chief Privacy Officer of Dun & Bradstreet, the information services company. And you also had some time at Pfizer, so you've had the challenge with health-related data as well. So it's been interesting as the day has evolved. We've heard a lot of different things about information, and all the technological innovations that are happening around us that are generating even more amounts of information that can be created, mined, and stored with big data, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, robotics, blockchain is another, cloud is just a huge opportunity for collecting more data, as well as new business models based on information, where people used to sell products, well, now they're also interested in selling the information around those products and services. There's lots more devices and platforms in which to use and store information on-prem, in your own location, in the cloud, on devices that your employees bring to work, on your own devices that the company might own. And of course, this issue of Internet of Things, which is just all these sensors that are on any kind of device anywhere inside of a building or outside of a building. So huge amounts of ways that information can be stored. And then the different kinds of information. You've got the sort of the traditional things you think of PII, PHI, personal health information, financial information, employee data, customer data. Then you have intellectual property, you have trade secrets, you have other confidential information of your company, and then information of other companies that you also get. And email is a huge amount of information, contracts, and of course, all the data related to services that you generate. And within this context, then you have regulatory schemes emerging, focused on the creation, use, mining, storage, and protection of information. They're sector-specific. There's critical infrastructure. There's, of course, data protection regimes in individual countries around the world. And then, of course, cybersecurity, information security regulations. So, in this, cacophony of activity, how do you manage information? I think that's the key thing that we're going to talk about today. You should all feel free to interject, raise your hand, ask a question, provide some context or some perspective on what you're doing. But we thought it'd be helpful to start off with just help defining, what is information governance? Because I think it means different things to different people and different organizations. So I'm going to start off with, I think, a very concise one, and then perhaps Avis and REA will have others. But information governance is the activities and technologies that organizations employ to maximize the value of their information while minimizing associated risks and costs. So that's sort of one way to think about it. Avis, do you want to?
So the way we think about it is it's the method by which we take information, the management of information, privacy, and security of information so that it is protected but is available for use when needed.
And I would add that it's not only available for use, but it's an asset that needs to be invested in and yet subject to regulatory change. I like the definition that Gartner gives for information governance, which is, and maybe come into accountability, the specification of decision rights and accountability framework to ensure appropriate behavior in the valuation, creation, storage, use, archiving, and deletion of information. And the second part is that it includes the processes, roles, and policies, standards, and metrics that ensure the effective and efficient use of information in enabling an organization to achieve its goals. It's a mouthful, but there's a lot in there. And if you parse through it, it's a good way to kind of structure your program.
So yeah, I would think of this then as sort of an enterprise-wide business issue that then has different sort of elements to it. So maybe you can help us think through about what are the elements that you're thinking about?
So for our company, and I think it's important to understand that we are a employee-owned company, and our business is not heavily regulated. And I think that background, because your approach to managing information is going to be different depending on the space you're operating in. So what happened at Parsons is I was charged in the compliance function with creating a data privacy program. And at about the same time, the IT folks were migrating information from one system to another, and they realized that they didn't know, where the information was. The information wasn't classified. And then the security folks, we do have one business unit who that does a lot of work with the federal government, defense work as well, and there are certain regulations under the Defense Federal Acquisition
Regulations.
rules that I didn't know.
DFARS.
DFARS. I didn't know if everybody would know what that meant, but under the DFARS that come online in December of 2017. So we had these 3 groups working on these things, and as I was having meeting with my working group, I realized that other people were kind of discussing the same things within their working groups. So we decided to bring all 3 of them together. We formed an information governance working group so that not only would we have the legal compliance, IT and security people involved, but we would also have the business units and the corporate functions involved. And so we developed what we call an information governance program plan with, and then everybody contributed to that by saying, what do we need to do to have a complete information governance program? And we came up with like 40 some activities. We assigned responsibilities, we assigned due dates, we determined the groups that were going to work on developing those things. And it includes policies and procedures and standards that we will develop, many that have to be delivered by the end of December to comply with the DFARS. But we expect to have a fully functioning program by March of 2018.
So an enterprise project is hard to define when you're global and you have lots of different groups. So we have affiliates in different countries who collect our crown jewels, our data. So in terms of products, it's critical to have an inventory of what data you collect and what are your crown jewels and data. Even if you were a single entity, if you have affiliates, often your affiliates are collecting data that you don't collect in corporate headquarters. Sometimes you know about it, sometimes you don't. You also have third parties who provide you with data, who resell your data. And so part of the information management is just understanding what we're getting from third parties and how our third parties are selling our data. So even data as a product or as something we buy and sell, it requires managing it on an enterprise, but with the affiliates and the third parties clearly under the governance program. Then you have, of course, internal data, HR data, finance data, and different groups like that, and how you manage that kind of data as well. So it's trying to get a sense of what you have. So data inventorying is really critical in prioritizing, since it's so much data. The other thing is data changes. It's such a dynamic area. Every year I'm learning a new technology. So big data is so passé. Blockchain and blockchain and artificial intelligence are the current hot data collection methods. So whatever inventory you thought you had a year ago, it's already dated and obsolete and legacy, as your data folks are collecting new types of data for different types of purposes. So it's a dynamic process to try and manage your data, and it's resource intensive when a company wants to use its resources in other what they consider more productive ways.
We work with a lot of companies in the area of trade secrets and confidential information, and I think it's fair to say that most companies have not inventoried the information they have. They haven't, categorized or classified the information, and they haven't prioritized the information. So these are, I think, sort of the first steps to do, because at the end of the day, you can no longer protect all the information you have, so you really have to determine what is that information that is most critical, whether from a regulatory perspective, a competitive perspective, reputational, financial, and really focus on that data. Are your processes in line to do that?
Yeah, what we did was we first determined how we were going to classify our information. And we ended up with 3 classifications. One was controlled, the second was sensitive, and the third was public. And controlled meant that there was some law or regulation somewhere that told you how to treat the information. Sensitive is information that includes our proprietary information or our clients' proprietary information. And public is public. And then we said, okay, what kind of information do we have to put the classifications on that information? And so we determined our best source of our information was our retention schedule. So we took our retention schedule, and the schedule we had did not assign owners of the information. So we took a best guess at who the owners of the information is, and we took a stab at classifying it, because I knew if I sent this out to the businesses and the corporate functions with a blank sheet of paper, that it was going nowhere. So what we did was we sent to each corporate function and business unit a spreadsheet that had a list of information, a proposed classification, and we asked them, do you know where this information is stored? Do you know how it's transmitted? And do you know if there's any access restrictions to the information? Yes.
When you say storage, just to clarify, do you mean geographically?
We meant if it was in a specific system,
Okay.
not where in the world it was stored, but where it was stored not only electronically, but where the hard copies were.
Thank you.
Do you want to talk a little bit about how you've
Sure.
done in Bradstreet's approach?
So we have 3 processes, parts to it. It's data inventory, data mapping, and data classification. Data inventory is what data you have and where it is, how you prioritize it, what are the crown jewel data assets, and generally what kind of data you collect. And again, that's dynamic, so it's constantly changing, but at least have some sense of what your data is. Data mapping is how it is the flow of the data, both geographically and in terms of systems. Coming from the outside in, problem in our world is data cloud services are a critical part of data transfers and data storage as well. So you need to understand your cloud provider and their subcontractors and how that data is flowing around the world, because local laws actually impact, national laws impact whether you can, how you can transfer the data. We are confronting a lot of data localization requirements in different jurisdictions, and so to understand where we're storing our data, And then finally, we do have the data classification policy, and you must classify data. I mean, that's critical in terms of how you handle it. So we have 3, but it's almost 5 by the time different people have different preferences of categorizing it. But essentially, the 3 are two which are highly sensitive data, 2 which are kind of intermediate, and the one little one that can be publicly available.
I didn't mention when I just did a quick overview of sort of the regulatory landscape, sort of data localization issues, which is, sprouting up, China, Russia, the EU, South Korea. I mean, there's just a lot of now country-specific requirements that really will require that you know what data you have where and who has access to it.
And creates redundancy obligations. So a lot of countries, at the very least, data localization has 2 parts to it. One is you have to store, and in most jurisdictions, store, fabricate, use, process in country. That is justified for law enforcement purposes or security purposes. It's also an employment purpose and in local utilization. So the minimum of data localization is you have to store it in country. Russia requires that you do all 3 of those in country. China, for a lot of different areas, the new cybersecurity law
Right.
require the same. There are also export restrictions. So some don't allow exporting at all. Some allow exporting under certain, so Malaysia is for certain agencies, like credit reporting agencies, it just can't be exported except under certain conditions, consents, all kinds of things like that. Some have some conditions about exporting, and some, as long as they have a local database, they're okay with exporting it. But yes, and they vary, and you get these data islands, essentially. And Europe is getting to that data island where you have to keep the data in place, and getting it out of that jurisdiction is very complicated. And data is so hard to localize because even if where the data originates, data may be collected in one jurisdiction, but data leaves footprints all over the world. And so you can collect data about Russian citizens anywhere in the world just because the data flows that way, but the Russian government has taken the position that data about Russian citizens, wherever they are, is subject to as I take a broad view of what personal information for Russian citizens, what falls within this data localization law.
When Avis talked about sort of this cross-functional working group that Parsons put together, you talked about security, IT, legal and compliance, some of the business units. You didn't mention HR, and I want to sort of come back
Well, I
to.
said corporate functions.
Okay, so but when you think about, this is an intensive people process. People engage in every aspect of the creation and the mining and the storage and just sort of, So let's think more broadly about the different roles and teams that need to come together. The various stakeholders internal to your organizations, and how do you actually bring them together? How do you build sort of a seamless cross-functional team?
Well, what we do is, on our information governance program plan, we also determine what groups needed to work on what aspects, okay? So those things that are required by the DFARS, our business unit federal is that business unit. So they would bring in people with that expertise to work on the policies and procedures, the security controls around the information. As I was developing our privacy policies and procedures and the requirements of complying with the EU U.S. Privacy Shield, then I worked with a group from Talent Management, which is our human resources. So in terms of being efficient, we decided that we were only going to bring in people we tell the working group, this is what we're doing over the next 2 or 3 months. But we would only bring in the people who needed to participate in those discussions. And so then when it's complete, let's say when we completed our privacy policies and procedures, then we give it back to the working group for them to, because it's important to get different perspectives on this, and then for them to ask questions to understand and for them to have buy-in before we make it available to the employees.
So we negotiated for a year a RACI responsibility on data governance with different groups. Because everybody said, no, that's really their responsibility. Nobody really was wanting the R or the A. But we did negotiate a RACI matrix with key stakeholders, and it is subject to renegotiation and is consistently and constantly being renegotiated. I think the EU GDPR forced us to getting ready for that in May of 2018, forced the company to formalize it. We're fortunate because we're a data company, have a data governance group. And although they are mostly product data governance, they've very nicely, or maybe just been forced to assume oversight of data generally, with privacy and compliance at their side. So they are often the one accountable.
So they're the owner, I mean, are there clear owners of sort of the overall governance approach?
Yes, but we consider that the accountable, right, the owners. So they would be accountable, although each group and function in the company and everything owns certain data elements. We also have a data steward program where we have stewards for every data element. And each group assigns a data steward for the data that they collect on their own. Again, the rate that how you divide that, because data often shifts. So legal has lots of data, but we're not the owner of almost all the data. It's other people giving us data for litigation purposes and for advice purposes. So we had to kind of negotiate because it's quite who classifies the data. The owner has to decide the importance, the significance of keeping the data and how they're going to classify it. So we have this through the data governance group. We meet together. We do have executive leadership and owners that with sponsors, executive sponsors, from secure data security and legal as the co-owners of that responsibility.
So talk a little bit more specifically about the role of compliance, in this broader framework.
So compliance has a couple of roles. One is we have developed a platform where we keep up to date on the chain. We collect data in about 221 countries. And so we have actually collected, thank goodness for law firms that send out their free information of legal developments, but we have actually developed a database where we collect all that information and assign. So one of the key roles we have is simply making groups aware of changes in law, but more that the platform actually requires, depending on what the changes are, to assign. They sometimes require modification of procedures or policies, sometimes a modification of what data they collect or how they collect it. So compliance certainly has a critical role in both keeping each group up to date on the legal changes. We firmly believe that each group owns compliance. We're there to support them and counsel them. But if everybody says, well, compliance is a headache, it's not mine, first of all, we can't do that. We don't know it as well as they do. And they have to own it because that's the best way to keep it. So we have a program that Lisa, who's sitting here in my team, runs, which is having global groups. We have 6 leaders in a risk management program that help us identify risks and make sure that they own those risks and the mitigation and developing controls on that.
Avis, do you want to talk a little bit about the compliance role at your company?
Well, at my company, compliance has taken the responsibility for managing the information governance program with IT and IS, but we have what's called an information governance program team, and we do the heavy lifting. So most of the decision-making about the structure of the policies, the procedures, controls are taking place in that group, which consists of people from security and IT. We're obviously a very different kind of company. Our information, for the most part, the information we have is our information. And, but we work in 28 countries. So and the majority, we have about 15,000 employees. About 10,000 of those employees are in the United States and 5,000 are in the Middle East. And and then we have some in Europe. So we have to be aware of the, obviously, the requirements. But sometimes our presence in a country is, we may just have a few employees there managing something, so it's not the same kind of information management that is required by other companies. So I think that, I said all that to say that I think that it's if you don't, if you're not a company that is collecting a lot of information from other resources, then your approach is very different, and you're really talking about how you manage and protect your own information. You know, we are in situations where we have information from clients. It may be their proprietary information. So the scale is much less, but the importance is still there, because if you lose it, then you still have the same risks that other companies have that are more public-facing.
How does the corporate culture play into this, in particular in how you engage with employees on the issue of information governance, how you might monitor their activities?
So we have two related programs. We actually do privacy and risk assessments on a risk basis, but we do them every year at different parts of the company and different third-party vendors and so on. We take advantage of that. We do use that to be able to identify risks and gaps, and then recognize controls. But then we do in-person training. So in addition to the regular corporate training that one does while we're in country or in unit, we will take advantage of that to make sure that we do in-person training and awareness. So we do that, and then we take advantage of events like Privacy Day to bring home, again, the importance of the requirements that we have for data governance and data compliance.
We are in the process of developing training for our employees. We have not, I should say it this way, outside of talent management, it's handling a lot of, all of our employee data, and outside of people who are working on projects where they're handling client data, we have not focused on informing the employee population about the importance of protecting data and managing data. So that is one of our deliverables as part of the Information Governance Program Plan for this year.
We also have a privacy by design. Think of that privacy by design program. We have privacy impact assessments for every new technology or new product or new use case, and that keeps the awareness very high, because they can't get a product approved or a system approved without going through our PIA process.
And how is the information governance program connected to a sort of the enterprise risk management approach? And I'm going to sort of add on to that. And is your board aware of the information governance program? Is it something that they review or they want to hear about on an ongoing basis?
So our enterprise risk management program is the overlap of which we're a part of, and it's a relatively sophisticated risk program, a bottom-up risk program of which data and compliance is a piece of it. Obviously, there are other risks that come up as well. So we use that model, the risk enterprise risk management program, as the overriding part of the compliance program. And yes, the audit committee and the board are very engaged, very involved. But we're a public company as well, so we have the SEC, a cybersecurity guidelines requirement, and that also drives how you build up your information governance program, because their data inventorying, data mapping, and classification are critical to meet the SEC requirements.
So the compliance function at Parsons is about 4 years old. We had an ethics function that took care of the code of conduct and the training and the investigations. So about 4 years ago, we created the compliance function. And so I'm the first compliance officer at Parsons. And one of the first things I did was to And the board was interested in us having a compliance function. So one of the first things I did was conduct a compliance risk assessment. And the idea was, where are we missing an infrastructure to support compliance by the businesses and the corporate functions? And the two areas that bubbled to the top were export controls and privacy. And so with regard to privacy, I report quarterly to the audit committee of the board on the progress of the information governance program plan.
Great. Oh, that's terrific.
Yeah, we also have a third-party program for vetting third parties.
Yeah, that was actually my next set of questions. So, we've been very focused on inside your company, how you're managing these issues, who's involved, how you report up. But, you're connected in a variety of ways to lots of third parties. Some of them are your vendors, your business partners, suppliers, lots of different contractors, lots of different third parties. How do you manage the information that they get of yours and that you might get of theirs?
So in terms of third parties that we use, we have a third-party compliance program that requires vetting of third-party vendors and partners, both in terms of export control and anti-corruption controls, but also privacy controls if they are engaged in data collection or data reselling. So they're suppliers or reselling our data. That's also an ongoing. So they have to be vetted to be onboarded, and then there's regular reviews of that. And then there's always contract requirements as well, and then part of the monitoring would be some audit program.
So what is you talk a little bit about the monitoring, because that seems to be the biggest challenge that companies have, is you do this, grand due diligence as you're as you're deciding whether to hire a third party, and as you onboard them, you sign the contract, you file it away either virtually or in a file cabinet, and then.
So two things. One, we actually sell a product that we use ourselves called Compliance Check, which has ongoing alerts when things change. So certainly for export controls or for PEPs, the program we have would alert you if there was a significant change in terms of the company being charged with bribery, or if there's been a change of ownership, so that a new person who's not a permitted person, SDN, has acquired the company. That would be one way of ongoing. But the second one is annual reaffirmation of whatever the questionnaire was in terms of their practices, that nothing material has changed, because material things do change over time. And then on a risk basis, because to be able to audit all your vendors when there are thousands of vendors is not viable.
Right.
But I think so long as you have a risk-based audit program or review program, whether it's a desk audit or an in-person audit, depending on the level of the risk, often desk audits are going to be sufficient, is a way. But again, you have to you have to do some risk assessment on your vendors, and it's only the highest level one that you're probably going to have those limited resources in terms of auditing.
So we have, I would say, different aspects of monitoring and controlling our third parties. One, we have third parties called agents who are in other countries, and so our focus there is not violating the FCPA or anti-bribery and corruption laws. And so in terms of information, they're not getting really information from us. They're representing us in countries to help us to get business. Then I would say that another group is those people who do get, third parties who do get information from us, and those would be primarily people who, where we outsource information from talent management. And so we, as part of the selection process, we evaluate their privacy procedures, and then we impose certain privacy requirements on them. And then third parties outside of talent management, by and large, they're not receiving information from us, but we do require in all of our contracts that we have provisions that say, that require them in the event that they're, in that case, getting proprietary information from us. The other thing we do is with our joint venture partners, we have non-disclosure agreements with them.
Let me just pause, and if anyone has any questions at this point, we're going to shift gears a little bit. No? Okay. Let's talk really in the context of information security, because that, I think, has sort of gotten companies to be more organized in how they govern more broadly their information. Reading about breaches pretty much every day, and all kinds of information. So much was focused on PII and PHI and credit card information, but now more and more, IP, trade secrets, other sort of, proprietary information, and information not just, copied and stolen, if you will, but also destroyed. We've seen, the Sony hack destroyed both financial information as well as proprietary information. So, in this very dynamic, evolving threat environment, is there sort of a rush to sort of protect versus, really thinking through the whole pipeline of how information sort of comes in and how it gets used? Give me a sense of, people are not just focused on the perimeter, but they're focused on protecting the information where it is and determining in more specific ways who has access to it.
So it depends on to some extent, on the regulatory regime that you're under. Certainly, if you have federal contracts and Department of Defense, they have, and then this year imposed even stricter cybersecurity requirements. So certainly, in that area, and in terms of NITS and their regulations, make sure that you have that kind of protection. Most countries, the rubric is adequate administrative, technical, and physical safeguards in some way or another, which is for you to determine based on what the technology is at the time. That's what the FTC, and it's a sort of evolving standard. Again, I think you need to sort of identify where your risks are, and the risks are, cybersecurity and hacking by foreign governments or by thieves certainly is a critical area of vulnerability, but internal threats are equally risky.
If not the highest risk area.
Right, and so your program has to be based on, cybersecurity has gotten a lot of attention. We still have to comply with all the cybersecurity requirements. Again, cybersecurity is defined differently in different countries. So in China, cybersecurity means government access to your systems, whereas in the United States it means something else. But nevertheless, the internal safeguards you have on your access controls and how you do that. HIPAA assessments, if you have healthcare requirements, is very strict. So it does require sort of overseeing how the FTC, we actually on the FTC, how we define adequate safeguards based on decisions and consent decrees. So you kind of have to keep up with the consent decrees, at least know what is not adequate in terms of your security safeguards. But that is, and the European Union also now is more and more emphasizing security requirements, certainly in GDPR and Privacy Shield. So we have to kind of keep up with the technology that way. There are some organizations that share information. The FBI and the national security agencies have encouraged sharing of information subject to antitrust law requirements or exemptions. But there are some ways to share risk threats, external risk threats at least.
So I would say, at least from my perspective, and I'm not at all an IT person or IS person, but I think our approach, security's approach, has been to over-control information. So, for example, the information that is generated by the Federal Business Unit is in what's called a high-security environment. And the reason I say they over-regulate it is the government doesn't require it, but they've decided the way to manage it is to only make that environment accessible to people who are in the Federal Business Unit who are U.S. citizens. So, it's like, they minimize the risk by eliminating all the other risks. And when we're talking about protecting information, it's also a question for the kind of work we do. We design, do engineering work. We control access to the spaces that the people work who do that kind of work, because it's not only electronic information, it's the work that they're doing at the time. So physically, again, even though it's not required, access to the spaces where those people work is limited. You just can't walk into the space. Even our hard copy privacy, information is in a room where you have to have card key access. The floors where federal business unit employees work, you have to have card access. So it's a question of not only protecting the information electronically, but also protecting the space where that work is being generated.
And protecting space, one rule we had in a prior company I worked at is that you had to check your cell phone in before you access the place, because that camera on the cell phone is probably the most dangerous thing in terms of data security you have. And so that access included not bringing your cell phone in.
We talked about different roles, but neither of you mentioned the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, and whether or not you have that role and how that role plays into information governance.
We have that role, and they basically, once we put our policies and procedures in place, then their responsibility is to determine how that information is going to be secured. And I can't really speak as to how they do that, but I mean, they partner with us. They, for example, in terms of the Information Governance Program Plan, they are taking the majority of the responsibility in complying with the DFARS. They're providing information in terms of what's required, but they take care of the technical aspect of making sure that it is protected.
And where do they report into?
The CISO reports to the operations.
And for us, the CISO is critical. I say the two groups we work with most closely is data governance and the CISO and privacy. Those three groups in compliance are regularly twinned or tripleted together.
And where does your CISO report?
Our CISO and our data governance both report into the Chief Technology Officer.
Okay, so there's lots of different, I think it's so new for most companies that it's still evolving. I think when it first, the CISO role first emerged, it was really under the CIO, and I think companies have realized that it really sort of needs to be separate from the technology.
I was going to say that last year, I would say in 2015, the CISO reported to the CIO. And then in 2016, he was moved from under him, and they both now report to the person who's over operations.
Yeah, so lots of different models, still very much evolving. Aria, you mentioned information sharing, and at the end of last year, Congress didn't do many things in 2016, but it did pass a sort of a cybersecurity information sharing law that created certain incentives, but also dealt with certain antitrust issues so that companies in the same sector could come together and share more information about threats to their systems and their information. And, neither of you are in critical infrastructure, but you certainly feed into critical infrastructure. I'm curious, Avis, in the sort of construction engineering world, is there a group that comes together that shares information?
I would say no. I think there have been attempts. There was people who do construction, engineering, kind of out of this group, started, they have one call on focusing on data privacy. But I don't think it's I mean, if there is a cohesive, ongoing group in that area, I don't know about it. Now, on the construction side, we do have a group that's called the Construction Industry Ethics and Compliance Initiative, CIECI. And we meet a couple of times a year. And these are people who are doing, obviously by its name, construction, and major subs to construction. So most of them don't have global issues. And the emphasis is really trying to help construction companies to address the issues that global companies face, but from, so like making, like if you're a big company, everybody has a code of ethics and that kind of stuff. And so providing smaller companies with code of ethics and approaches to compliance and ethics initiatives, because in smaller companies, a lot of those people have other jobs to do. So it's kind of like a consortium to support smaller companies, but to provide them with the same kinds of information scaled for
Right.
them.
Diane Sands from Boeing mentioned that there's something in sort of
Yeah,
the
that's
defense initiative
right,
industry.
right.
Yeah.
It's similar to
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
right.
But hasn't yet gotten into sort of information security.
No.
And there are information security organizations that do share threat information and attack information. Actually, the law gave some antitrust relaxation of rules, but privacy is protected in there. So you have to make sure that when you share that information, you're not threatening providing personal information. But it is helpful. It's not the answer to the extent that companies are willing to share threats so that you can patch, or that there's going to be an announcement about a vulnerability. So I think it's on Tuesdays they announce the vulnerabilities, to make sure that those patches are in place beforehand by the companies, so that when it's publicly known, by then you already have your patch in place. But and that's the security side.
Right. And you mentioned the FBI and the importance of sort of having that relationship, because they get information that, provides some sort of indications of maybe others in your industry that are being attacked, other bad guys, as I call them, who are looking for specific information that may be in your sector.
And that's very important. And there's the FBI, your local FBI, who are more than willing and will come out. You just have to say hi, and they'll be out there in no time to talk to you about both sharing information that they have, but also encouraging you to share with them. And then down in D.C., there are units that are available, and it's very helpful, especially with ransomware. There are legitimate, real ransomware threats, and then there are some who are just trying to extort money with actually not having put anything on your system. But when you get a ransomware, I would check with the FBI, your local FBI, and see if they know about the group and about the threats. Often they're on top of that and can tell you whether this is a real threat or not. Ransomware is a serious issue that you should be aware of, and your sister should be aware of, and how to handle that.
Any questions? No, I think we've sort of captured sort of the life cycle of information and some of the challenges that are present and evolving. So I think we'll close now. But thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.